What's up, guys? Welcome back to the workshop. I'm your host, as usual, Conductor Steamology, and welcome back to another episode about All About Sodor, where we, of course, talk about Sodor. On today's episode, we are going to be talking about the Mid Sodor Railway, arguably one of the most important pieces of history to the island of Sodor. There is a lot of information and a lot of stuff we still do not know about it, but there is a lot of history and a lot of characters by it. So let's waste no time and get straight into the history. The Peel-Godger community approached the mining companies who saw advantage in the Peel-Godger connection, and following a series of meetings at Ulstead Castle, chaired by John Arnold Normanby, Earl of Sodor, the Mid Sodor Railway Company was formed in 1872. They brought up the tramway and relayed it to Board of Trade Passenger Carrying Standards, and opened it in 1874. There were 4 stations: Arlesdale, Marthwaite, Farquhar Road, and Arlesburg. A road coach link was provided from Peel-Godred to Marthwaite, pending on the competition of the mountain section. They were thus predominantly in a position to earn revenue, while the most difficult part of the line was under construction. The site selected for the Submit station at Alstead Road stood at 867 feet above sea level, or 264 feet higher than Cassiney Howen. Though the two places are, as the crow flies, only 1.5 miles apart, Mr. C.E. Spooner of the Festinian Railway was consulted, but as he was occupied with the North Wales Narrow Gauge Railway, the actual survey was undertaken by his son Edwin, who advised that his railway should climb in a series of loops, thus effectively increasing the distance between the two places to 6 miles, and reducing the gradient to manageable propositions. He advised that the actual length of the climb should be for 5 miles at an average of 1 in 100, and that it should be arranged in steps, with every level or nearby level stretches between them. He explained that this would allow laboring locomotives to ease off and blow off steam, or alternatively to gain speed and therefore impetus before tackling the next climb ahead. Edwin Spooner's survey and estimates were accepted, and necessitated the cutting of 4 tunnels, and it was here that the company's troubles began. Having cut 2 tunnels, it was found, inevitably, that their expenses far exceeded estimates, and, with 2 more tunnels in prospect, money was running short. They economized by cutting down clearances of those which had been allowed on the Festinian Railway. But even so, they had little money left for the last few miles up to Peel-Godred. Fortunately, there was no expensive civil engineering problems here, and the only casualty was the fine central station they had planned for the town. They had to settle instead for a temporary terminus on cheaper land in the outskirts along the Arlesdale Road. A branch line to Ulstead had also been planned, but this had to be dropped too. The line was opened throughout in October 1880, with number one, the Duke, hauling the opening train. They had hoped for a June opening following the Board of Trade inspection, but the inspector, distributed by these scanty clearances in the mountain section, refused to allow this, even though he could not faulty anything else. When, however, it was pointed out by the Spooners that the clearances to which he took expection were, if anything, more generous than those which had been allowed and passed for the Festinian, he paid the line a second visit at the end of September, and reluctantly passed it on condition that similar safety precautions to those enforced on the Festinian should apply, namely all cartridge doors should be locked between Arlesdale and Ulstead Road. This was no real hardship. On the upward journey, water stops were needed at both places anyway. While for down trains at Olmsted Road, the routine brake test was common prudence required for starting the descent, also gave ample time for attention to the carriage doors. Natives soon accepted this door drill as a matter of course, but visitors to the island were apt to complain at being imprisoned without trial. The company servants, however, never heard such complaints. To them, as Sudrians born and bred, tourists were decent enough folk, but all the foreigners, particularly English and Manx, were probably not quite right in the head. The bulk of passenger traffic was between Peel Godred and Arlesburg, but it was the mines which provided the railway with its chief revenue. Local goods and passenger traffic was slow in developing so. Bearing this in mind, the Mid Sodor set itself from the first to encourage visitors and tourist traffic. Proposals made to the Isle of Man Steam Packet Company met with a favorable response. It was arranged that steamers should call at Arlesburg twice daily in the summer and twice weekly in the winter. Arlesburg became the port for Peel Godred, and between 1890 and 1923, the railway enjoyed a period of time of moderate prosperity. The normal journey time between Peel Godred and Arlesburg, a distance of 25 miles, was, for local trains, 1.5 hours. But the pride of the line were its boat expresses run in connection to the Isle of Man steamers. The line had to be cleared to allow these trains free passage, and woe betide anyone who hindered the smart running of these trains. With 2 stops at Arlesdale and Olmsted Road, respectively, they covered the 25 miles in a very credible time for narrow gauge of 1.25 hours. Special observation cars were built at Arlesdale Works for these trains. The usual load was 4 bogie coaches, strengthened at busy times to 6. Holidaymakers in the island were catered for during the summer by a train which came to be known as the Picnic. This train put on between Easter and Michaelmas, left Arlesburg at 10 a.m. and was given a very easy timing. It would stop on request at beauty spots and places of interest to set down ramblers and picnic parties. The return train left Peel Godred at 3:30 to pick up the parties at the places where they had been set down. This train timed to reach Arlesburg at 5:10, thus returning passengers in good time for high tea at the Sacred Hour to Sodrian landladies of 5:30. While the mining companies had their block trains and paid well for the convenience, local goods traffic was slow in building up. At first, the guards' vans of local trains sufficient for partials and small freight, but did not suit larger items. Mixed trains were then tried, but passengers complained so bitterly at delays caused by shunting operations at stations that the company put on a daily goods train each way, which took anything and everything. It stopped to shunt anywhere on the least provocation, and was allowed a time of 2.5 hours in which to cover the 25 miles, hence the name the Horse and Cart, given to it by travelers and traders. Passengers were soon carried in the brake van on payment of half-third fare, but the company, wisely, would not guarantee the time of arrival at any station. The Mid Sodor served the valley well for nearly 40 years. It was well loved and had become a part of the landscape. Even its vagaries were a part of the local tradition. People assumed that it would last forever. It survived the First World War, though stretched to the limit, and had nearly succeeded in making goods of its main maintenance tiers when it covered a blow which it could never recover from. And all good things had to come to an end. World War II brought an upsurge of traffic, but while the locomotives were lovingly maintained as far as possible, both tracks and goods stock suffered. The mines suffered too. They were stripped almost beyond safety margins to assist the war effort, and in consequence were closed one by one during 1945. That and Casnehauen alone remained, but when this was abandoned because of the flooding in December of 1946, the railway, having no longer any reason for existence, was abandoned too, in January of 1947. Two locomotives, Falcon and Stewart, were brought by the Sodor Aluminum Company to assist in the expansion project they had on hand. This was completed in 1951, and the two engines, after standing sheeted under tarpaulins for the better part of a year, were sold in 1942 to Sir Handel Brown for the Skarloey Railway at the knockdown price of £25 each. They retained their old numbers 3 and 4, but after rebuilding, they were given SR livery and renamed Sir Handel and Peter Sam respectively. The third and oldest engine, number 1, a George England type tender saddle type tank, had been built at Boston Lodge to the order of the Earl of Sodor, and presented by himself to the Mid Sodor Railway in 1880. They named it the Duke in his honor and chose it to haul the opening train. Duke, perhaps on account of age, had found no buyer, for interest in veteran steam locomotive preservation had in those days had hardly begun. The Duke was left oiled, greased, and sheeted up in Arlesdale shed. The last chapter in the Mid Sodor Railway story took place in 1969. Ever since 1947, storms and land ships had played havoc with the abandoned Arlesdale shed. 22 years of neglect had allowed this site to become almost unrecognizable. It was hard to imagine that there had ever been a shed, let alone a little engine sleeping inside of it. Local people were, however, convinced of it, and after listening to the tale after tale beginning, my father used to say, or grandfather once told me, the thin clergyman was inclined to believe it too. He was pursued by the Rev. Wilbert Audrey and Boston, and Mr. Fergus Duncan, the small controller, of the 15-inch gauge Arlesdale Railway to help them investigate. The search took time and patience until Crowburn's Gate. There, through the kindness and generosity of Sir Topham Hatt and the present of Earl of Sodor, who shared the cost with Sir Handel Brown, the old veteran was a new lease of life in company, and the two other Ceterans, Skarloey and Reneus, had his old shed mates numbers 3 and 4, whom he knew the old days as Falcon and Stewart. And that is the entire history of the Mid Sodor Railway. Overall, I have to say, this story and this railway is so fascinating to me. The fact that they were able to pull through and close to bankruptcy just impresses me so much, and goes to prove that Thomas is more in depth than you might think. So, that's it for today's episode, and we will continue on to next week's video, which will be about the Coldefell Railway. I hope you like it, like and subscribe, and I will see you guys next week.